Crafty fam, it's Alex Vanover, and welcome back to my craft room. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make these gorgeous giant paper flowers. You guys, these are so flexible and there's so many different ways that you can make DIY paper flowers using your Cricut. I cannot wait to teach you everything I know about making paper flowers. So let's get into it. So to get started with your giant paper flower, the first thing that you need to do is import your SVG file. So if you got the Spring Farmhouse mystery box, you will already know where to get the giant flower, the giant DIY Alex flower. If not, you'll have to choose another SVG file. And I will link a very similar SVG file down in the description that you can use if you did not get the box. So you'll just click it in your recent uploads and then click Add to Canvas. And then we can start working on it. So we are going to make a total of 3 different flowers out of this file. So I'm going to show you how to do that and how we're going to set everything up accordingly. So in order to work with everything, I'm going to begin by going to the layers panel and ungrouping all of this. And then I'm going to be sizing all of this first for our largest flower, and then we'll kind of move down to the 2 smaller flowers because they are going to be the exact same size. So the first thing I'm going to do is begin with my base. And so I'm going to take my base and I'm going to size it to about 4 inches wide. You really don't need a huge base underneath all your petals. And I like to use a pentagon for my base shape because that way I can put 1 petal on each side of the pentagon. When you use a circle, sometimes it can be a little challenging for beginners to space that properly. So a pentagon just makes that a little bit easier. So we'll go ahead and set that aside. Actually, I'm going to turn everything the colors that I'm going to be making it. Since I'm going to be using a bunch of different colors, I need to make sure that I cut everything the right color. So I'm going to turn all of this to a darker blue. And then for the center of my flower, which is going to be, I'm going to eliminate this one because I don't need this piece. But I'm going to take this one and turn it to, I'll turn it like a light gray. I'm actually going to cut it off white, but that's obviously not an option here. So I'm just going to turn it to gray and that will be good enough for me. So then for the center, since I'm going to be using a different color of paper, I'm going to make a couple of different centers. And that way I can stack them and actually layer them so that they look really good. So I'm going to go ahead and keep this first one at about 4 inches wide. That's good for me. Then I'm going to duplicate it and do one at 3.5 inches. And then duplicate it one more time and do another one at 3 inches. That way I can layer them on top of each other and give the center of our flower a little bit more dimension. So now that that's done, I'm going to set it aside as well, and I'm going to start sizing my petals. So I'm going to have 3 different layers of petals, and I'm going to make them 3 different sizes. So I'm going to do this one by one. I'm going to start by adjusting the height actually. And I'm going to start by sizing them 7 inches wide on all of my petals because that's going to be my largest size. So then once I have all my petals sized, then I'm going to go over to the layers panel and duplicate it. And I'm going to change this one to the next smallest layer of petals, which is going to be 6 inches high. And I like to have about a 1 inch difference between each of the different layers. That way you can actually tell that they are multiple sizes and give the flower lots of dimension. So now that I have this 1 petal sized, I'm actually just going to use the duplicate button to get the other 5 petals in this layer. So that should give us 5. So then I'm just going to repeat that by taking one of the petals and duplicating it one more time. And then I'm going to make my smallest layer of petals 5 inches high. So I'm just decreasing it by 1 more inch and then duplicating it till I have 5 petals for the smallest layer. So that's going to do it for our largest flower, and that's going to take up a lot of paper, but not to worry. If you did get the Spring Farmhouse mystery box, the large the giant paper flower, the biggest one, is the one that you got like 10 sheets of the same color. So we did have to do some different colors of cardstock in this box because we couldn't get access to all the same color for everyone. So if you got 10 sheets of the same color, that's what you should be using for the giant paper flower. And then the smaller flowers are going to take 3 sheets of cardstock a piece. So a total of 6 colors of cardstock. So it kind of just depends on what you have in your box and what color you want to make them. But I did want to say that in case you guys are only using materials from this box. But of course, feel free to supplement with your own paper if you want to change up those colors. Okay, so now to make the smaller flowers, we're going to do the exact same thing we did before. We're just going to make the flowers a little bit smaller. So I'm going to click on one of these flowers, or excuse me, one of these petals and duplicate it. And then I'm also going to duplicate one of the center pieces and bring it down here so everything's all together. And then also the base, because these are all the parts that we are going to need to make our giant flower. So then for this one, I am going to make the base 3.5 inches wide. So it's actually almost there. Actually, we'll change this one to 3.5 inches wide. And then for the center, I'm going to make that 3.5 inches wide as well. And I'm just going to do one center on this one just because I want the giant paper flower to really stand out. So I don't want to do quite as many center pieces and make it stand out quite as much. So then for the tallest layer of our petals, we are actually going to work with the width instead of the height. And I'm going to make my largest petal width 5 inches wide. So that's going to be layer number 1. And I'm going to be cutting my flowers, my smaller flowers out of a lighter blue. So before I go any further, I want to change my blue areas to a lighter blue, just to make sure that I have the right color. And then I'm going to do my centerpiece like a craft color of cardstock. So I'm going to be making it this dark brown, but it's really like a light brown. I wanted to keep the farmhouse feel. So I'm using more muted colors and more neutrals than I normally would in a flower. So once I have my first petal sized correctly, which is 5 inches wide, notice I switched from adjusting the height on these petals to the width on these. And that's just the preference that I found for how much paper I wanted to use. But there's really no hard and fast rule about paper flowers. So honestly, guys, you can follow whatever rules you want to. These are just the rules that work well for me. So I have this one petal, and now I'm just going to duplicate it to create a series of 5. Because even though these are smaller flowers, we're still using the same number of petals. They're just going to be a little bit smaller. So once we have all of these, then I'm going to duplicate them in order to begin the next layer. And the next layer is going to be 4 inches wide. And we'll duplicate all of those. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we will duplicate one more time and make this one 3 inches wide. Duplicate until we have enough. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Perfect. So we have a base, we have 3 layers of petals and 5 petals of each and a center. So that's really all we need. Actually, I'm unsure about whether or not this is going to be too big. So I'm actually going to duplicate it and also cut one at 3 inches wide, just so that I have some options when it comes to making my flower. Plus, this is going to be a whole nother color, so I don't have to worry about taking up the light blue paper that I have saved aside for these flowers. So since we're making a second smaller flower that's the exact same size, I'm just going to click and drag a box around all of the materials for the smaller flowers. So that's all of the light blue stuff plus the brown centers, and I'm going to duplicate everything. So this is a big project with a lot of petals, but don't worry, don't be intimidated. This stuff is really, really easy to do. Honestly, creating the file and setting it up in Design Space is far and away the hardest part, in my opinion. So then once we have everything created, next we definitely need to save our work because we've done so much to this file. So I'm just going to call this DIY Alex Giant Paper Flower Set, since it's a set of 3. And then once it's saved, we can move on to making it and double check that we have all the correct mats and all the things. So then I'm going to click the green Make It button. And I'm going to choose on a mat with 12 by 12 paper since that's what I have access to. And then I'll click Continue. So we're going to see that I have the centers for the giant flower, and then the smaller paper flowers, all the craft colored ones are all on the same mat. Then we should have 6 light blue mats. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, perfect. And then we should have 10 of the larger mats and the dark blue paper. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. The only reason I'm limiting those is because that's the paper that I have, like I said. So if you have paper and you have more than enough, feel free to do more mats than I did. That's just how I set my flowers up. So once I know everything looks good, I'm going to go ahead and click the green Continue button. And then once my Cricut Maker 3 connects, I can choose my cut setting. And for all of this cardstock, I'm going to be using 80-pound cardstock. So I found that the medium cardstock setting works best for my machine. And I'm also going to click Remember Material Settings so that I don't have to come back to my computer in between mats and re-choose the cut setting. Now, another tip that I have for you, because I'm not going to include a shot of me cutting all this paper because it's going to take a really long time, but something that may help since you are cutting so much paper is you may want to keep a ball of aluminum foil nearby, and as you're cutting things in between mats, you may want to take your blade out of the blade holder and just punch it through the aluminum foil. All that does is just clean the blade off in case any paper gets stuck to it, because at least for me personally, if anything is ever going to get stuck to my blade, it always happens with paper. So I like to do that periodically when I'm cutting big paper projects like this. So I'm going to go ahead and cut everything, and I'll see you guys over at my craft table to show you how to assemble your giant paper flowers. So to get started with your giant paper flower, first let's talk about the tools you'll need to complete this project. Now, my favorite way to fold paper is with a bone folder, which is a tool that looks like this. I can link the one that I have from Amazon down for you guys in the description below. But for those of you who don't have a bone folder, you can also use a squeegee tool like the ones from 143 Vinyl. Now, I would recommend something that's a little bit on the thicker side. So something like the Cricut scraper tool might be a little bit thin. I like a thicker squeegee for this. And then for the glue that I'm going to use, I'm just going to be using a hot glue gun as well as plenty of extra hot glue sticks. And something that is optional but is not required is the silicone finger protectors. I got mine from Dollar Tree and they come in a pack of 3. And I like to put one on each middle finger as I'm gluing my petals down so that I can push down on the hot glue and not burn myself. So that's an optional tool, but of course you don't have to have it. And then of course you need all the pieces of your paper flower. So I have all of my petals stacked into the small, medium, and large. Here's my base and my center pieces. Now I'm just going to be showing you how to fold and assemble the paper for the largest flower because I've already made the 2 smaller paper flowers, which I'll show you guys at the end, but the process is exactly the same for all 3 flowers. So you're just going to take this process and do it 3 separate times, and then you'll have a set of 3 different flowers. So the first step that we're going to do is we're going to be folding all of our petals. So I'm going to set the center pieces and the base aside since we don't need them right now. And we're going to put a fold in all 15 of our petals. So I'm going to show you how to do this with the scraper tool, and then I'm going to switch to the bone folder because that's the tool that I prefer. But like I said, I know most of you will probably have the scraper, where maybe not as many of you will have the bone folder. So I'm going to start with my largest petals, and since this is textured cardstock, I do like to have the textured side of the paper facing up. I don't think it really matters which side that you put facing up in your flower, as long as you're consistent throughout the whole thing. And honestly, the pattern and the texture is so subtle, I don't even know that anyone else would notice. I just like to have all of my texture facing up. So I go ahead and do that before I even start folding so that I always bend all my paper in the correct direction. And there we go. So I'm going to start with our largest petals, and what we're going to do is we're going to put the scraper tool against the back of the flower, and we're going to kind of pull it along the petal, sort of like you would when you have scissors against a ribbon and you're curling the ribbon with the scissors. We're going to do a similar motion like that with our whole hand. So the largest petals are going to be the hardest ones to do, but we're just going to kind of pull the scraper against the petal like this. And let me show you what it looks like from the front, because this is how I normally do it. I like to hold it with the front facing up and just kind of pull it like this. And the reason that I don't like to use the squeegee tool quite as much is because it can put some ridges and things like that in your paper, where I find the bone folder to be a little bit smoother. But I understand if this is a project that you're brand new to, you may not have a bone folder, and you may not want to buy a bone folder just yet if you don't know if you're going to make more paper flowers. So either way, you just continue pulling the scraper tool along the back side of the flower until it's curled to your liking. You can also kind of help it along by pulling the top of it back, just creating a bit of a crease with your hand. And when you're done, your petal should have a shape like this, where this is the bottom section, and then it should curve up a little bit at the top. So that's what it looks like using the scraper tool. So now let me show you with the bone folder. I'm gonna follow the same process, but since this is much thinner, it's just a lot easier to pull that along the back of the petal. And it looks something like this. And I usually have to do a few pulls per petal. I'm not awesome enough to be able to do this in one pull, but if you are, good for you. So as you can see, I just have a little bit of a smoother fold in the front of my petal, but either way, they both work the same. So you're gonna follow that same method in curling all 15 of your petals, and I like to do all the curling while keeping the petals sorted before I do any gluing. So let's go ahead and finish that step. So let's go ahead and get into the next step. After everything is curled, the next step we need to do is we need to glue the flaps of our petals together to give it some movement. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put a dot of glue on the bottom inside corner of the right hand flap and fold the left one over top of it like this. And so as you can see, that causes the petal to fold upwards like this. And when you folded it correctly, if you look at it from the side, you want the top of the petal to be facing in one direction, and you want the bottom of the petal to be facing in the other direction. You do not want to curl your petals like this because it's gonna end up looking super funky. So you wanna be sure to curl, like I said, or stack the left flap over the right and fold like this. You also want to put the glue just barely on this right flap. If you put it super far inside the flap, you're gonna have to really bend the paper and it's gonna make a really dramatic fold. And if you like a flower like that, that's fine. It's just gonna make your flowers a lot taller. Whereas if you just subtly fold the two over, it's gonna create like a wider flower that's not quite as tall. So that's just your preference, and it's just gonna take some practice to figure out what that feels like, but that's my advice to you for gluing. So I'm just gonna take my hot glue gun and put a little bit of glue on that right flap and fold it over like this. Then you do have to allow each one to set for a couple of moments, because if you don't, they can fall apart and the structure of your flower won't be in as good of shape. So the step does take a few minutes, but we're gonna repeat that same step on all three sizes. So it's just the same thing over and over. So to begin assembling your giant flower, start with the largest petals after everything has been glued, as well as your pentagon base. So we are going to begin on the first layer, gluing one petal in each window of the pentagon base. That's why I like to use pentagons as my shape. But in this next step, where you place your glue and where you place your petals is going to make a difference. So I recommend that if you want the flower to be on the larger side, that you want to place the glue just barely inside each window for the petal. And you also want the petal to just barely be stuck to the base. So let's say that we just glue a little bit right here. We're gonna have a much wider reach with our petals. Whereas if we push the petal further into the base, that's gonna make the final diameter of the flower a lot smaller. So if you're going for the giant look, you wanna just put your glue maybe a ½ inch in on each window and then just barely stick that largest petal to it. And just like all the other steps, we are gonna have to hold the petal to the base to make sure that the glue can set. So I'll show it to you a little bit up close. I'm gonna put the glue right about here, make a line about like this, especially for these larger petals because they are heavier. And then I'm gonna glue it about like that. And remember that hot glue is not immediately going to dry, so once you stick your petal in place, you can move it around a little bit until you get it where you like it. So now that this is set, I'll flip it over and show you. There's not a ton of overlap here, but it is well secured to the base. So now we're just gonna repeat that step with all the largest petals and each of the windows of the pentagon. So here's what the outer shell of our flower looks like, and here's what the base looks like on the bottom. So now we're just gonna repeat that same step with the remaining petals, but there is one really important key to making your flowers look really natural. And that is to make sure that as you go to the next smallest layer of petals, that you always put your petals in between the windows, as I like to call them, of the larger petals. So that means I'm gonna look down here where the two petals are overlapping, and that's where I'm gonna put my first petal for my next layer so that it kind of ends up in the window of the larger petals. If you glue your petals in the exact same place that you glued your previous petals, it's not necessarily going to look bad, it's just not going to look like a very natural flower, so that's why I always prefer to put it in the windows. So now I'm gonna follow that same process of putting a little bit of glue down and adding in the second smallest layer. And I'm not gonna take up a ton of that center because I still have a third layer of petals to go as well as a centerpiece. So I like to keep my petals pretty close together. So as you can see here, I'm not gonna glue in very far. Just as much of the base as I need to. And that way I still leave plenty of room for the rest of my petals. So now that we're into the third and final layer of petals, you'll notice that the windows in the inside of the flower line up with the original largest petals. And that's the way that you want to do it. That way, again, they're on almost like an offset look to all of the petals. So I'm just gonna finish up by gluing that final petal layer in between the windows of all of the second layer, like this. So once we have all of the petals glued into our flower, next it's time to work on our centerpiece. And if you'll recall, I cut 3 of the centerpiece pieces, and I really like how they look layered together. So let me show you how to bend each of the stem pieces so that it gives it lots of movement and looks really, really pretty together. So I prefer to use the squeegee for this part of it. And what I like to do is I like to put the squeegee tool right at the base of where those little stems kind of leave the center. I like to put my fingers on the back and actually just bend them straight up like this so that they're perpendicular to the base. I think that gives them a really, really nice, like straight up type of look. And I can do a few of them at a time. So I'm gonna do that on all 3 base pieces, and then I'll show you what else I like to do to kind of get them to keep their shape for when we glue them all together. So then once all the pieces are bent, what I like to do is flip the pieces over and bend all of the stem pieces into my hand so that I can just see the base at the bottom, kind of like this. I think that kind of helps them all go in a similar direction, and it really sets in that fold. So we'll hold that for just a second, and then I'll repeat it on both of the other pieces. And then once all 3 pieces have been folded, now it's time to layer them together. So I'll start with the largest piece, and I'm just gonna put a little dab of hot glue in the center of it. And then I'm gonna lay the second piece down inside that center. But what I'm gonna try to do is again offset the little stems with that original first layer. So when that glue is still wet, you can kind of turn the base so that they're going in between the windows of the original base layer. And then I'm gonna follow suit one more time with that smallest inner piece. By sticking it down into the center and then kind of turning it while the glue is still wet, so that the layers really look offset and there's tons of texture and things to look at. And in theory, if you wanted to, you could do 5 or 6 of these and really give it tons of texture. However you want to make your flower is honestly totally up to you. And that's part of the fun of these types of files is you could do 4 layers of petals, and you could do more petals if you wanted to. There's just so many ways to customize it. But regardless, whenever you have your center finished, now of course it's time to put it down in the center. So I'm gonna go ahead and put a decent amount of hot glue in the center there. Not that the center is gonna be, holding a ton of weight or anything. I just like to make sure it's good and secure. Then I'm gonna drop my center down in there and kind of use my silicone covered finger to manipulate it towards the middle so that it ends up staying exactly where I want it to. And then I'll just push down on that center until the hot glue is set. And I can kind of pull up on these pieces if I want that center to have a little bit of extra texture. And once you have your center in place and set, your giant paper flower is finished. So now let me show you what the whole set looks like all together. So then you can follow all of the same steps to assemble the other smaller flowers in the exact same way. And you guys, I am obsessed with how these turn out. Real quickly, I did just measure my flowers because I knew you guys would want to know what size these are. So with the largest flower, my flower diameter was approximately 14 inches at the widest area. And then each of these smaller flowers is approximately like 9 to 10 inches across, depending on how you place your petals on the base. But we used all the same methods to make all 3 of these giant flowers. And as you can see, they have such a beautiful effect when they're all together. They just make such a wow factor and a beautiful, beautiful statement. So now let's talk quickly about how to hang your giant paper flowers in case you want to put this set on a wall. So in order to hang your flowers on the wall as an arrangement, the way that I like to mount my flowers is by flipping them over and going to the base. And then I just take a short piece of ribbon or string. This is like the type of balloon string that you would use to tie balloons. And the way that I like to do it is I like to put a little bit of hot glue on each side of the base. And then string that ribbon right through that hot glue so that it can support the weight of the flower. Now, I am always a proponent of using things like command strips with these flowers, just because I always change my mind on the placement. And of course, if you decide you don't want the flowers there forever, I prefer not to poke a bunch of holes in my walls. So I like to mount all of my flowers this way, and then I can use command strips or command hooks to hang each of my flowers on the wall and arrange them just as you like. And then if you ever change your mind, you can always hang them somewhere else. So I hope that helps in case you want to arrange your beautiful flowers on a wall. Which color scheme of the flowers ended up being your favorite? Do you like the dark blue paper with the off-white center, or do you prefer the light blue paper with the craft paper center? Let me know down in the comments below. And if you learned something in this video, make sure to give it a like and subscribe to the DIY Alex YouTube channel so that you never miss when I upload a brand new Cricut or DIY tutorial. If you're not already a part of my Crafty fam on Facebook, I would love to have you join my Facebook groups. So I'll be sure to link both of them down in the description below. And don't forget to connect with me on DIY Alex on all of my social media platforms because I love getting to know you guys and meeting each and every one of you. All the hearts.